people's ability to synthesize vitamin D, and moreover, how their vitamin D levels even affect their health is different according to Good morning, friends. In this video, we're going to discuss why blood levels of vitamin D don't mean the same thing for you and I. But before we do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to support the channel's growth. Now let's get started. Before we get started, let's talk about two aspects of this discussion. First of all, the import of it. This discussion is very important. If you are at all interested in vitamin D, your interest probably began from studies that are ancient that showed that at low vitamin D levels, certain health consequences happen to people. However, these studies were based on a certain group of people. They don't apply to other people. Second, I wanted to point out, other than the importance of this discussion, the fact that very few people know this. Many people know that our skin pigmentation affects our ability to synthesize vitamin D from the sun. Fewer people know that there are genetic variants that not only affect our skin pigmentation, but separately affect our vitamin D levels without affecting our skin pigmentation and affect our ability to synthesize vitamin D levels. There's even fewer people that realize that irrespective of how well we synthesize vitamin D, the actual vitamin D levels in our bloodstream mean different things for different peoples according to where their ancestors came from. So this is a very important discussion. I hope that you would forward it to your friends or family who are interested in vitamin D as well. I've unfortunately heard this very little discussed among public educators on the subject before. And this is the main reason why I've hesitated from talking about vitamin D historically. Because it really depends where your ancestors came from. And other than that, we know quite a bit less about optimal vitamin D levels than we realize, but we'll get into that later. Now let's begin with, in this video, I'm going to have two parts of the video. The first part is to try to establish why we are different, why we have such different genetics. It's not a skin color or race thing. I want to discuss that first so we understand why we're different. And then I want to give you evidence that vitamin D levels mean different things for our immune system, for cardiovascular disease, for metabolic syndrome, even for bone mineral density. The main reason that vitamin D is called a vitamin. Anyway, let's get started. First, why we're so different. To understand why we're so different, we have to know a little bit about where we came from and our journey along the way in ancient history. History that wasn't written. History that is known through the study of genetics. Geneticists at the moment have some disagreement of opinion. Some geneticists believe that humans originated in Asia and that a portion of humans moved to Africa. There are another portion of geneticists, which I would say are the majority, that think that we originated in Africa, that we moved to Asia later. That's called the out of Africa theory. Here, I'm going to talk about human migration according to the out of Africa hypothesis. First, it's known that the first separation of humans genetically, according to father's line haplogroups, that's genetic groups that associate with each other, was the haplogroup A00, which is found currently among pygmies like the Khoisan in southern Africa. They are light-skinned people with a little bit less curly hair than darker-skinned Africans, and among the Ethiopians in Ethiopia, a very ancient people who we'll talk about more on the channel in the future. So that division in the human ancestry happened 250,000 years ago in Africa. About 125,000 years ago to 60,000 years ago, humans left Africa. Not all of them, and they didn't all go through one route. For example, Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, native tribal Indians, and Papuan peoples may have left through different routes. It's not completely certain. But there was a large group of humans that went through one route, which was the Arabian Peninsula, then Western Asia, other parts of Western Asia. These people later, between 40,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago, immigrated from Western Asia to Europe. Now, the people who had moved to Asia from Africa are the ancestors of most of the population of the world. That includes, for example, East Asians, Southeast Asians, Native Americans, Europeans, and so on. We just talked about Europeans briefly. What about the East Asians and Native Americans? Briefly. And by the way, I would love to talk about this in much greater detail in a future video if you guys are interested genuinely. I just thought the video would tank, so I've never made a video about ancient population history. Anyway, so when they had migrated to Asia, a portion of the people who had migrated there were founding a group for both Native Americans and East Asians. They split at some point when the North American continent was still attached to Western Asia through something called Beringia. So the ancestors of the Asians split, one group of them through several waves. crossed Beringia and entered into North America over thousands of years. Now, briefly to review what we discussed here, what's the point? Am I telling you this so you can remember where people went? Not at all. I'm just trying to point out something. We diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago, and we moved around the world in times where we could not move easily or quickly, and remained in certain places for thousands of years without interacting with each other. So, for example, today it is thought that all modern Europeans share a very similar ancestry. In fact, that on the father's side, all people who 1,000 years ago have descendants today are ancestors of all Europeans. This is what's thought by geneticists. This means that we come from a homogeneous origin. But it wasn't always homogeneous, even among Europeans. For decades of thousands of years, Europeans were as different from each other in Europe as modern East Asians and Europeans are. There were 3 or 4 groups of founding groups for modern Europeans, and they looked and acted and behaved genetically very differently from each other. Today, as I said, Europeans are quite homogeneous. But when you compare populations across continents who have not interbred for long periods, you'll find divergences in genetics that are instrumental in people's health. So we were separated ancestrally for thousands of years. But how exactly do we end up genetically different? What happens is that humans experience mutations. Not very frequently, but when they experience these mutations, 3 things can happen. Either the mutation can be harmful, in which case it'll usually cause the person to die a very early death, or to be unable to have children, to procreate, and therefore the mutation will go away. Second, a mutation could be neither harmful nor helpful, in which case, most likely over time, it will not grow disproportionately common in the society, meaning that it won't offer an advantage in the person who had it in reproducing relative to others. But third, rarely a mutation turns out to be helpful. When this mutation turns out to be helpful, either through environmental selection, which means the people with the mutation are more likely to grow into reproductive age or more likely to have more children, or through sexual selection, the mutation gets spread among a society. This is how we mutate and differentiate from each other. Now, speaking of selection for mutations in populations, human beings have been selecting for mutations that affect our pigment of our skin for as longer than we've been humans. About 1,200,000 years ago, the first ancient broad selective sweep for a pigmentation gene occurred, and it was in the MC1R gene. That is the gene very associated with redheadedness in people. It's thought that this mutation occurred because at the time we had lost a lot of body hair and became particularly vulnerable to the sun's damage on B vitamins in our bloodstream. So we had to pigment further, get darker to protect us from the sun. Interestingly, you guys may be thinking that, hey, since Europeans were with Asians for a long time, they might be similar genetically. And then Europeans, once they separated from the ancestors of East Asians and Native Americans, were probably very similar genetically. But as I pointed out, there were different populations originally. The phenotype of a European, being light-skinned, light-eyed, often having light hair, only became common about 7,000 years ago. Before that, there were Europeans, for example, one of the ancient European groups were the Baltic hunter-gatherers. The Baltic hunter-gatherers were dark-skinned, dark-haired, and blue-eyed. Whereas on the other hand, the Neolithic farmers that migrated to Europe in the last 10,000 years had light skin, dark eyes, and dark hair. Much lighter skin than the blue-eyed Baltic hunter-gatherers. But note that even though these blue-eyed, dark-skinned Baltic hunter-gatherers lived in Europe, they had genetic polymorphisms that made it easier for them to produce vitamin D. For example, they had genetic variants in the gene that encodes the 7-dehydrocholesterol, that is the cholesterol precursor of vitamin D, causing them to have more cholesterol available in their skin to turn into vitamin D. Over the tens of thousands of years of our human history, each of these groups that I mentioned developed different genetic variants to affect their vitamin D synthesis and their pigmentation. For example, not all of the groups are very well studied yet, but there is evidence that Europeans experience this, that Native Americans experience this, that East Asians experience this, that South Asians experience this, like Indians and so on, and that Africans also experience this. Now, if you want to see genetic evidence for these selection sweeps occurring in each of these groups, check out the citations I just put on the page. Now, these selection sweeps didn't just occur for variants that happened within humans, but some variants arose out of the human race. For example, in Europe and Asia, the ancestors of East Asians and Europeans interbred with Neanderthals. This is something well known, and people talk about it a lot. Not many people realize that we got certain polymorphisms that are very instrumental to our health and adaptation from these Neanderthals. They include, among the East Asians and Europeans, BNC2, the gene BNC2, and the gene OCA2. Although we'll talk more about OCA2 in a little bit. Today, Europeans have the highest genetically calculated vitamin D status. But remember, vitamin D status depends on genes that affect vitamin D. These genes also affect pigment, but not all of them do. Some of them affect pigment as well. So it's not your pigmentation genes affecting vitamin D, it's your vitamin D related genes affecting both pigment and vitamin D through pigment and separately. Now, before we move forward, I want to really drill in on this point. We're not talking about races. This isn't the way someone's skin color is. It is not just skin deep. We're talking about true genetic variation that is dependent on actually two things, mainly geography and endogamy. The issue was, as you remember, that human beings separated for long periods of time and stayed in certain areas away from others so they couldn't interbreed with them. Moreover, specifically what they did was interbreed with each other. This is called endogamy, a practice that's declined through human history, including ancient history, but existed quite a bit. And endogamy allowed a greater spread of certain genes among a society, making that society more homogeneous and more different than others. So, geographic separation, endogamy, evolution, and sexual selection. Those are the four reasons that today the greatest predictor of your vitamin D status in some papers will be your ancestry or ethnicity. Again, don't let this fool you. This is not a racist discussion. This is not really about ethnicities. It's about genes. But the genes just happen to have certain patterns among certain groups geographically and according to their mating historically. I hope this was very clear and nobody will be sensitive about the subject of race or skin color, because it's not about that. It's about genetics. And in the future, these groups may be less clearly defined than they are today. Next, before we finish talking about how different we are, the final topic I want to bring up is the fact that there are two kinds of ways we became different with these genetic variants. Some human populations had a genetic variant arise, and then they spread that genetic variant to others. So that genetic variant had one origin. There are other genetic variants that occurred more than once in different human populations. An example of a variant that only developed once in human history and really distinguishes populations is, for example, the SLC24A5 gene. This gene has a certain SNP which arose somewhere between 22,000 years ago or 28,000 years ago in Western Asia. This polymorphism was found among Eastern hunter-gatherers in Europe, Baltic hunter-gatherers, not Western hunter-gatherers, interestingly. This polymorphism was found in a variety of ancestral groups of Europeans, but it's thought in current academic research to only exist in Europeans. Interestingly, I am homozygous at this SNP, which means it also exists in Arabians. Arabians, unfortunately, have not been studied at all on this subject. So, there are genetic variants that are unique to Europeans, but there are also genetic variants that are common between Europeans and East Asians. Remember, Europeans and East Asians lived together for some time before they separated. For example, at the NADSYN1 gene. This gene is located close to the gene that codes for 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is the cholesterol that's converted into vitamin D. It's thought that this polymorphism causes an overexpression of 7-dehydrocholesterol in the skin. What would that mean? That means that even with the same skin color that you have, keeping all else equal, you will produce more vitamin D due to having more of its precursor available in your skin for the synthesis of vitamin D. So, Europeans and East Asians share polymorphisms there. They also share polymorphisms, I'm just giving you examples. They share polymorphisms also in the RXR alpha receptor. That is a receptor that frequently forms a dimer with the vitamin D receptor. It's not completely clear what it does in the skin, but it's selected for as well and likely has an impact on vitamin D. And looking at it from a different perspective, Africans share some things with East Asians that they don't with Europeans. For example, they have underexpressed GC and DLK1 genes. What I want you guys to remember from all of this discussion is just that we have an ancient history. We were constantly adapting our skin color and vitamin D synthesis, and that we spent extremely long periods isolated within certain ethnic groups, spreading mutations among us that were different than other groups. And these mutations, we'll talk about now, really impact how our health functions. Now let's begin with bone mineral density. You'll remember from earlier episodes that the reason vitamin D is called a vitamin, the reason it was discovered, is because in its absence we develop weak bones. We don't retain calcium well, and our bone density decreases, making us prone to fractures and other things, including the disease rickets. But even bone density is not affected similarly across ethnic groups. For example, specifically, people with African descent, including African Americans, who are the ones who are thought in America to be most in danger of this because of vitamin D levels, are the most resistant to decreases in bone mineral density from vitamin D. They're so resistant, honestly, that it's not completely clear at what level a deficiency occurs for them in regard to bone mineral density. Now, in other studies, you may find, for example, that Europeans and Chinese, people of Chinese descent, will have reduced bone mineral density with reduced vitamin D, whereas Hispanics and Africans will be a bit protected. In other studies, you may find that Hispanics and Europeans can have decreases in bone mineral density, but Africans are protected. But even in those studies, by the way, you find a difference in calcium retention between Hispanics and Europeans. We don't need to get into too much detail there, but all we have to know is that the most important element of vitamin D status, the effect on calcium, is not only unequal between us, but in particular seems to affect people that are white more than other people. So that the other people who are in danger of having low vitamin D levels are actually less affected by it than the white people. And beyond bone mineral density, vitamin D supplementation or vitamin D levels affect our immune systems differently. You'll remember from a previous video, one of the reasons to supplement with vitamin D is for improved immune responses to viruses or bacteria and to reduce autoimmune disease activity. Well, both of these things are affected by where your ancestors are from. For example, in Canada, Canadians of European descent experience better immune responses from vitamin D supplementation, whereas Native Canadians do not. In fact, interestingly, Native Canadians have a lot of tuberculosis. I wonder if these things are related. Separately, look at the multiple sclerosis model. In multiple sclerosis, serum levels of vitamin D, meaning your blood levels of vitamin D, are associated with disease, with multiple sclerosis, in white people, but not in blacks and Hispanics. Now, moving to even more serious health conditions, actually, before we get to cardiovascular disease, let's even talk about diabetes. Many people know that Africans or people of African descent, especially African Americans, have an unusually high diabetes incidence. But you may not know that vitamin D levels are associated with diabetes in Caucasians or European Americans, in Hispanic Americans or Latin Americans, but not in African Americans, the people who most have an issue with diabetes. Now, moving on to one of the most important elements of our health, cardiovascular disease. In cardiovascular disease, low vitamin D levels are associated with cardiovascular disease incidence, but particularly among people of European descent and not so much among, generally speaking, darker people. For example, coronary heart disease incidence is higher among Europeans and Chinese with low vitamin D levels, but not among Hispanics and people of African descent. Further, let's look at stroke. Stroke incidence is associated with low vitamin D levels among people of European descent but not African descent. Heart failure incidence also associated with low vitamin D levels among people of European descent but not African descent. So what you can see here is that not only do we synthesize different amounts of vitamin D due to our genetics and also due to our location in the world, but the amount of vitamin D we have in our bloodstream affects our health differently, probably due to other genetic variants that we selected for, that protect some of us from low vitamin D levels. These variants are not yet well understood, but they are evident in our vulnerability to ill health from low vitamin D levels. So when people have been telling you that your vitamin D status is very important for something, they've mostly been reading research almost exclusively on people of European descent, and they mostly have no idea how those vitamin D levels would affect your health specifically if you were not European. Anyway, friends, let's review what we learned here. Human beings have had an ancient history. In that history, we separated from each other for tens of thousands of years. Throughout that history, we developed mutations. During that history, some of the mutations that affected our pigment or our ability to synthesize vitamin D were aggressively selected for in our different ethnic groups that were not interbreeding with each other for a long time. Because of that reason, people's ability to synthesize vitamin D, and moreover, how their vitamin D levels even affect their health, is different according to where their ancestors came from. Finally, in general, most of the research on the harmful effects of low vitamin D levels applies mainly to people of European descent, and generally speaking, darker skinned people seem to be a little bit protected from the harmful effects of very low vitamin D levels. I hope this was helpful for you, friends. This is sort of the video I would have wanted to hear myself on the subject of vitamin D on YouTube, and I've never heard anyone talk about it really before on YouTube. I just learned about this through my own research over the years. I feel like it's very helpful. I hope that you maybe can share this video with some of your friends so that they have a better understanding of how varyingly vitamin D levels affect our health. Anyway, friends, I hope you found this helpful. This is introducing to you really the basis of why we're going to separate our discussion in the coming videos on European people separately. We're going to talk about what we know currently in 2022 about optimizing vitamin D levels among Europeans, and we're going to talk about, as much as we know, each of the different ethnic groups' research. We're going to get into all the details, the dose responses, the dangers of having high levels, the dangers of having low levels, and we're going to get into the details. So people who are asking in the comment section, it's all coming up. I hope you guys are enjoying this series. Please send this video to people you know who are not of European descent that care about their health, or that you care about their health, because they're unlikely to learn this elsewhere. Anyway, friends, I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon.